Hello, this is Donna Gilcher of Starfish Speaks. Join us every Sunday, 1 to 2 on WERE 1490 to discuss hot topics in education. We will talk about resources in the community that address the needs of children with disabilities and enhance the lives of parents and much more. So join us every Sunday, 1 to 2 on WERE 1490 for Starfish Speaks. If you have a question, we have answers.
News Talk Cleveland, WERE, Cleveland Heights, WENZ HD2, and WZAK HD3 Cleveland. And streaming live at blackplanetradio.com. Views, opinions, claims, or representations are those of the participants and are not those of 1490 WERE AM's owners or management. Broadcast or rebroadcast in any form of 1490 WERE programming is prohibited unless otherwise agreed to in writing.
It's that time again. Welcome to another edition of Starfish Speaks right here on News Talk 1490 WERE. I am your host for today. My name is Greg Stuart, alongside my co-host and my right-hand man, Mr. Willem Ekels. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. You?
I'm good. Ready to do this. We have a very exciting show today. So sit back, relax, get a cup of coffee, hot chocolate, whatever you like. Starfish Speaks right now.
Hi there, how are you?
Oh, man, we got a very special guest today. It's our original co-host, Donna Gilcher. Hey, Donna.
Hey. Yeah, I needed to join you guys today because I've got a very special friend that's coming to talk today.
All right, so that works.
Holly's on the line. So today really is, we're going from Cleveland to Hawaii to California to bring this information to our listeners in Cleveland.
Now, I just want to let you guys know real quick, you know, Willem and I are kind of jealous right now because you guys are in all this warm weather and we stuck with all this cold and snow and everything, so.
Speak for yourself. I overheat easily.
Oh, man, well, okay, well, fine then. I will speak for myself. Yeah. Shoot.
Well, it's okay. This morning it's 69 here in Oahu, so it's a little cold and I got a turtleneck on.
Sounds like really nice
Okay,
weather,
cool.
actually.
All righty.
All right, so do we have Holly on the phone with us yet?
Yes.
Oh, welcome. So
Welcome, Holly.
Welcome, Holly.
Holly.
Thank you. I'm excited to share information about ADHD because educating ourselves about this disorder and what can be done is key.
She serves on the Child and Adult with Attention Deficit and Hyperactivity Disorder, CHADD, and Star Academy, a non-public school services that services students grade 2 through 12 with complex learning disabilities. Holly, I'm so glad to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be here. Donna, I'm having trouble hearing you. Is anybody else having that problem?
No, I can hear.
Well,
okay.
Depends on whether or not we're taking turns.
Okay, Donna's voice is a little bit lower on my end.
The producers told me I've got to make sure that since there's a delay, that I don't overtalk someone. So I'm going to ask my question, and then I'm going to mute myself so that we can hear your answer, Holly. So
Great.
I know that you've been recently at the CHADD conference. So can you give us an update on all the exciting things happening in the ADHD world?
Sure. Now that's quite a bit to cover, but I'll start off with a few tidbits. You know, last year at the conference and this year, there was quite a bit of emphasis on emotional regulation and particularly on ADHD and anxiety. Folks with ADHD have a likelihood, 30% of them, to also have a diagnosable clinical anxiety disorder. And we know that having ADHD can be quite stressful in life anyway. But in addition to the greasy buildup, especially if somebody hasn't been treated for ADHD early enough in life, that greasy buildup can lead to anxiety and just being able to keep up with life and the hidden curriculum of life, as well as education in the schools. And then there is the co-occurrence of an actual separate likely clinical anxiety disorder, as I said, and being able to address not only the ADHD but the anxiety is key. So there were workshops on dealing with homework, homework wars, which anxiety is a piece of, dealing with avoidance, adults and children with ADHD. Avoidance tends to be quite a big issue for adults and kids. And there was a great workshop on sluggish cognitive tempo, which still isn't in the DSM. The diagnostic manual takes quite a while to catch up with culture and life.
Wow, so a lot of things that we want to go deeper into, why we have you this next hour. So let's start out with that sluggish cognitive tempo, or as Dr. Berkeley I know is trying to change it to concentration deficit disorder. I have been reading about it, and I'm just fascinated with this. And so if you can tell us a little bit about it, and then is it possible that parents that have difficulty with getting their kids regulated on ADHD meds, that they need to explore this instead because their kids could be misdiagnosed?
Can you repeat that, Donna, your last question?
So I wanted us to be able to go into this sluggish cognitive tempo a little more, or what
right.
Dr. Berkeley's trying. And then as you're talking about it, could you tell us, there's parents whose kids, they've tried every one of the ADHD drugs and stimulants and non-stimulants, and their kids still don't seem to have improvement. And so is it possible that these parents need to explore that their child's possibly being misidentified and try to explore this concentration deficit
right.
disorder instead?
Great question. Sluggish cognitive tempo was looked at back in the 1980s with the question of whether sluggish cognitive tempo was another form of ADHD, and particularly related to inattentive type, or whether it was a separate disorder in its own right. And what they found back in the 1980s, but which hasn't been implemented and hasn't come forward, which is, makes that whole diagnostic piece for somebody with symptoms of ADHD more challenging. That this information hasn't come forward in the clinical and diagnostic world in the way that it should. Is the symptoms you'll hear are similar to that of inattentive ADHD: the daydreaminess, the confused attention, the sluggishness, the sleepiness, physical lethargy, slower processing speed, a tendency towards errors, but with sluggish cognitive tempo, a higher tendency towards errors, a slower at responding to a stimulus. And with sluggish cognitive tempo, that is consistently across all environments, where we know with ADHD that the response to a stimulus can be quite quick and it can be quite slow. So it's variable across environments. More symptoms with sluggish cognitive tempo is the poor focus, being slower to orient in an environment, less attention to important tasks, trouble filtering out important tasks and unimportant tasks, which turns out not to be so much an executive functioning issue as it is distractibility by the inner world. And then some social symptoms of a tendency to be withdrawn and passive, isolated, having low initiation, socially as well as across the board in life, tendency towards anxiety. And these kids and adults tend to be overlooked socially. They tend to be the folks that aren't making anybody itch, but also become rather invisible because of their lack of initiation and their low energy level. So ADHD kids typically tend to be rejected, whereas those with sluggish cognitive tempo tend to have more friends than those with ADHD, but fewer than the norm, and tend towards isolation.
I think we
Oh,
actually...
I'm still here.
Okay.
Not sure. I think we might have lost
Yeah, I think
Donna
we
there.
lost. We lost.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Should I go on or hit
Yes,
the pause
Yeah,
please.
button?
keep
Yes.
going. You're fine. Keep going.
Okay. So I think you're picking up from what I'm saying that back in the 1980s, that it was found that sluggish cognitive tempo truly is a different animal than inattentive ADHD. And one of the really important pieces is that those with sluggish cognitive tempo that didn't have co-occurring ADHD were not helped with stimulant medication. Some were helped with Strattera, but the stimulants didn't make a difference for those with sluggish cognitive tempo. So what has happened over time is that those with sluggish cognitive tempo have been misdiagnosed frequently as having inattentive ADHD and not getting the appropriate treatments. And Linda Pfeiffer, who's over here at UCSF and works in the ADHD world as well as sluggish cognitive tempo, has found that behavioral supports turn out to be the big kahuna, the big deal for supporting those with sluggish cognitive tempo, because they do have a very high tendency towards daydreaming and being lost in their own world, and they need those behavioral supports to keep tuning into the external world. Whereas we know those with ADHD often are reactive to the external environment.
If I can possibly start here with a quick thing, I am a little, just for the sake of those that actually don't know much about ADHD or much of this at all, maybe I just don't know much, but from what you're saying, I almost feel like you're describing what I first learned about of ADD back when I was first diagnosed with ADHD back in the 90s, that there was this thing of ADD versus ADHD, the one
Correct.
having hyperactivity and one not. Is ADD still a thing, or is this this sluggish cognitive tempo sort of the, say, fully defined version of it?
A really important question that you're bringing up. Now, ADD, and what now in official circles is strangely called ADHD, inattentive type, which means you X out the H, but you don't say ADD anymore. You say ADHD, inattentive type. Still is an ADHD disorder. It's a separate disorder from sluggish cognitive tempo. You want to hear another complication?
Sure.
Those with sluggish cognitive tempo have more than a 50% chance of also having ADHD. And those with ADHD have a little under half a chance of also having sluggish cognitive tempo. So, two different disorders. But yes, coming back to the ADHD question, there are three types of ADHD.
Okay. What are those three types?
So there's the hyperactive impulsive type.
Okay.
And then there's the inattentive type, what we used to call ADD that you mentioned. And then there's the combined type, the hyperactive impulsive and inattentive type. Now, personally in my practice, I have never met an adult or a child that was diagnosed with hyperactive impulsive only, ADHD, who didn't also have trouble with regulating their attention. But the hyperactivity and impulsivity is what gets the attention in the external world, because it can be irritating, annoying, disruptive. And the inattentive aspect tends to bother, the person or child themselves more, makes it harder to participate and filter and prioritize staying on track with what's required in the environment.
Okay, so let me kind of rephrase this, just make sure I totally understand what you're saying here. you said there's three types of essentially ADHD diagnoses. One being ADHD, which is characterized by the hyperactivity, and okay, and looks like we've got actually our other host back.
We got Donna back. Donna, you there?
I am.
All right.
I was listening on the internet to Holly's response after I got lost.
Okay.
Well,
So keep going, boys.
so as I was saying, just to clarify, so of those three types, there's the ADHD, which is with the hyperactivity, the more of the what we would normally characterize as that impulsivity and things like that. There's I almost actually I apologize. I'm actually thinking of remembering a classmate of mine from elementary school who could like never sit still, and his attention darted from every which thing that existed in the room, and there were some things that were actually provided to him to help him actually stay paying attention to the environment around him, which included a little sort of jelly kind of cushion that he would sit on to allow him to rock his own body and help keep him focused. And he always I know that he always said that he had ADHD, and I'm diagnosed with ADHD as well, but I always felt there was a big difference between us. What you're describing, like the actual like ADHD, I think is more like what he would be, that kind of that very externally visible kind of inability to attend and skipping from thing to thing. Correct?
Yeah. Well, and the inability to attend and skipping from thing to thing is the difficulty regulating attention. And that's excellent that the educational environment that you were in, that they recognized that they didn't just want to keep him still, but they wanted to help him, be able to still his brain, and that giving him a way to wiggle actually helps him to focus. And that's great.
And then, so I may have actually gotten a little lost in this because, as you said, it's kind of complicated. And there are these three different subtypes. There's three different types of ADHD. You mentioned the other, which was the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, just with that comma or whatever of inattentive type. Right. Which is basically what we used to refer to as ADD. What would that be more characterized? What kind of thing would that be? I mean, how would you define that one exactly?
Right. Well, it's the second half of what you described of your classmate from when you were a child. It's the difficulty regulating one's attention to what needs to be prioritized in the environment. And so there is the lack of the physicality, the overt full body movement and wiggling, the need to move. But there's often, more subtle fidgeting with the fingers or chewing on one's collar or on one's sleeve. That stimulates the brain to pay attention. But the inattentive type is naming the difficulty regulating what one pays attention to for how long and how one can, change gears with their attention. When the teacher says it's time to put things away and get ready to go out to recess, that takes a certain kind of attention and organizational skills to, and from one attentional state to another. So, if we were to rename the disorder today, we wouldn't probably name it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and then, either hyperactive impulsive type or inattentive type or I-type. We would probably name it something more along the lines of self-regulation disorder, because attention shows up as a big issue because, our full-time job as kids is going to school, and being able to regulate our attention is key to success in school. But we also know with ADHD, it's not just about regulating attention. It's regulating one's body movements, one's emotions, sometimes even one's sensory world. We see kids, a subset of kids with ADHD who have trouble regulating sound. So you'll get a kid that's very sensitive to the lighting, and they can hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, and it distracts them. So it grabs their attention, but it's also because they're having trouble filtering out that sensory input.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So, as you've been talking, and, I'm one of those kids that was ADHD when they had the old fluorescent lights, and I got to tell you, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the hum of the old refrigerators, all of those things used to drive me insane. My parents have the story of me unplugging the freezer at 4 or 5, and everything inside got destroyed. But let's go back for a minute with the cognitive concentration deficit disorder. It really sounds like it could it looks like I'm wondering if some of those kids are also falling on that autism spectrum, but it seems like, there's a OT, an occupational therapy program called How Does Your Engine Run? And it teaches kids how to either increase their activity and attention or decrease it so that they get into that, what we call the sweet point kind of thing. Is it really, are we looking at a need for increased occupational therapy in the schools to be able to address these elements instead of immediately going to medication?
For ADHD, occupational therapy can make a huge difference because it is about giving environmental supports to help the child self-regulate, across these areas that I just mentioned and that you're mentioning, world, their attentional world, their emotional world. I don't think with sluggish cognitive tempo, I think the problem is that the sluggishness is so hardwired that there's not the flexibility for whatever reason in this disorder in the brain to upregulate the energy level.
Okay, we've got a break, so hold that. We'll be right back.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. More Starfish Speaks.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you need to know about Cleveland sports, news, weather, and more is at newstalkcleveland.com. For instant updates, follow us on Facebook at newstalk1490 and on Twitter at newstalk1490.
This is Reverend Al Sharpton. Join the National Action Network, not because of what we have done, because we have done much, but because of what we are still doing. We need action around voting rights. We need action around health care. We need action around dealing with the injustice in the criminal justice system. Be a member of the Action Network that's out now, fighting for you. Call 1-877-626-4651. Or go online to www.nationalactionnetwork.net and become a part of the action.
Hello, this is Donna Gilcher of Starfish Speaks. Join us every Sunday, 1 to 2 on WERE 1490 to discuss hot topics in education. We will talk about resources in the community that address the needs of children with disabilities and enhance the lives of parents and much more. So join us every Sunday, 1 to 2 on WERE 1490 for Starfish Speaks. If you have a question, we have answers.
WERE Cleveland Heights, WENZ HD2, and WZAK HD3 Cleveland.
All right, welcome back to Starfish Speaks here on News Talk 1490. WERE. And we are live once again with our guest, Dr. Holley Seerley. Thank you again for joining us.
And please remember to call in with any questions if you have any.
216-578-1490. Again, that's 216-578-1490.
And boys, remember that today the 14th caller wins a gift certificate.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Too bad
Caller number
call
14. You win a special gift certificate. So we are also looking for the 14th caller. And as I was sitting here during the break, I have a question for Holley, if you don't mind answering. Is explosive behavior, is that part of ADHD also? Just out of curiosity?
Yes, it's not listed in the diagnostic manual as one of the criteria, and not everybody with ADHD has trouble regulating their emotions.
Okay.
But there is a large subset, parents will tell you, and clinicians will tell you, clinicians who work a lot with ADHD, that explosive behavior and difficulty regulating emotions often plagues, particularly children with ADHD. And again, if we had this umbrella label instead of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, if we had self-regulation disorder, we could more see that difficulty regulating emotions could be a part of the brain disorder of ADHD. I was thinking over the break too that the feedback that I'm hearing is that I'm sort of jumping ahead education and information wise, and really need to emphasize some of the basic information about ADHD, which is so lacking still in the world, even those of us who have ADHD or who work with ADHD. ADHD is as inheritable as height, and it is genetic, primarily genetic, and DRD 4.7, that's DRD 4.7, was the first gene was discovered related to ADHD, and UC Irvine made that discovery. And since then, over 20 more genes have been discovered that are related to ADHD. So we know ADHD is a brain disorder. And if self-regulation is, more the umbrella, at least our understanding at this point in time, more the umbrella label describing, more accurately describing the challenges of ADHD, then yes, explosive behavior, emotional regulation comes under that. Again, how much of that is the hardwiring of brain challenges, and how much of it is the greasy buildup of frustration for a child with ADHD, and how much is co-occurring conditions complicates answering the question for any particular child. But we know that many children with ADHD have a very low frustration tolerance. They get frustrated easily. They get bored easily. They need a particular amount of content stimulation or physical stimulation on their brain to keep their brain awake. And they need not too much stimulation that overwhelms them. And so, that sweet spot of enough, especially academic pressure on the brain in order to keep them awake but not overloaded is hard to come by. And so not only do they have low frustration tolerance, but the environment educationally is not always a great match for that level of stimulation that they need. And some children with ADHD have difficulty with flexible thinking. We know that, we're finding out more and more that the human brain is a feeling machine that thinks rather than a thinking machine that feels. So emotion tends to lead us in prioritizing what we pay attention to. And in the ADHD world, the unexpected, which is what gets our brain's attention anyway, the unexpected can be experienced as intensely disappointing. So a child is going to school and they think that they're going to have a particular thing happen first that day in class, and they come in and instead something else is happening, and they can have a big difficulty compared to other children in transitioning from what they were expecting to have happen to what is now happening. And you can see a child have a meltdown and wonder, what the heck just happened.
Now, if I can interject here, a question that I would have is then, is this why there are many children with ADHD who end up with a label of emotionally disturbed?
Yes. The emotional regulation issues often in schools leads the way to emotional disturbance. Emotional disturbance is one of 13 categories, one of 13 gates that are possible to go through to get special ed services. And sometimes children with ADHD, instead of the gate of other health impaired, are sent through the gate of emotional disturbance because of that reactivity. Yes.
And see, one of the things that, as a former educator, one of the things that oftentimes happens, and I know as a former administrator too, when kids get that ED classification, which 100,000 years ago used to be bad behavioral affective disorder, teachers start to look at the student from a paradigm that it's intentional. And it's that paradigm of intentionality that sometimes we expect a certain thing, so sometimes as a teacher what we expect we get, where when it's other health impaired, you've got a different paradigm that you've got on as a teacher, because then it's not something that the child that the child is intentionally doing, it's something that is part of their disorder and their disability. So there becomes a more helping response versus, oh my God, this kid is just out to destroy my class response that I oftentimes see. And so what are some strategies that you would suggest for teachers to be able to help them reshape their paradigm, but also create an environment in their classroom that's welcoming to a child that has that attention deficit dysregulation happening?
Right. Boy, I could write you a book about that. It's such an important question. I think because ADHD, the symptoms, except for the hyperactivity and impulsivity, tend to be so invisible, it's often hard for teachers to get that this child has a brain disability. It's not as you said, it's not bad intentions, but actually has trouble self-regulating, and that what they need help with is, skills on learning how to self-regulate. They need education on how their brain works and what they can do, and for that brain, and what they just have to live with temporarily. The misunderstanding of the intentional behavior means, these children get maligned, misunderstood and maligned, and their needs not met. So one of the things that makes a difference is indeed a relatively predictable, consistent environment. So, kids with ADHD need that calm, predictive, matter-of-fact environment so that their emotional world doesn't get triggered. Because once a child is stressed or anxious, then they're not going to learn. Their ability to empathize with others goes down. Their ability to self-regulate goes down. Their ability to use their executive functions goes down. So keeping, the stress level environmentally as low as possible is good. Having a place in the classroom that any child, not just a child with ADHD, but that any child can go to, a corner that has a bean bag, that has, an L-shaped, low-level shelving that has some books and some fidgets on it, where any child can go over and settle in, calm themselves down, and then come back to the learning group, can be helpful for a child with ADHD to learn how to take appropriate breaks when they're overloaded or when their emotions start to get, start to hijack their rational brain. Learning those strategies is really important.
Are emotional outbursts, are those part of ADHD also?
Yes. When there's a couple of the brain is con artist factors that feed into that, as well as ADHD realities. Tom Brown, who used to be at the Yale Adult ADHD Clinic, talks about the difficulty with time awareness that people with ADHD have. And he likes to say that those with ADHD have two time settings, now and not now. And if your two time settings are now and not now, then when something disappointing happens, it's hard to hold the bigger context of, this won't be so disappointing later today, or something good is going to happen with this change of plan. It's hard to hold that timeline that is beyond the disappointment of the moment. So you get a kid with ADHD who gets extremely disappointed compared to peers around something that wasn't expected. The ADHD brain, all brains, tend to prioritize the input from the world based on the unexpected. We drive our cars, and we can get from one place to another and then realize that we weren't paying conscious attention to our driving, and yet, we drove perfectly safely. But if a truck swerves in front of us, we remember that. That gets our conscious attention. And the unexpected grabs our attention. So for the child with ADHD, the unexpected turbo grabs their attention, and the unexpected is often hard for them to change gears with. And so you'll get a kid that has, either refuses to change gears or protests or falls apart. Yes.
Now, following up on something you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned something about homework wars. Would that be something that would be an example of, say, what would come out of these kind of outbursts or this kind of rigidity to that change in flexibility?
You got it. Yes, absolutely. The homework wars. One aspect of homework wars is the frustration, the low frustration tolerance, and the difficulty being flexible. There are other things that feed into the homework wars, some of which, aren't always about the homework itself. Kids come home from school, kids with ADHD, they tend to be emotionally exhausted. Their brains tend to be exhausted. Our brains utilize 20% of our caloric intake in order to run the battery pack of neurons in our brain. 20% of our calories go to our brain. So that's a lot of energy. I personally
feel like that might be a little low for me.
Huh?
I feel like that's a little low for me, but hey.
Yeah,
wow.
Okay. Yeah, and that's what, kids will come home from school and say, my head hurts, my brain hurts. And then we've got the research piece that shows that those with ADHD have a 5% lower utilization of blood sugar in the brain. So their brains are having trouble properly utilizing the blood glucose. And if you don't get the blood glucose, it's like you're not getting the gas. So
can't generate enough energy.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got a kid that comes home that really they're not only is their emotional fuel tank empty, their glucose in their brain fuel tank, can be empty. So they need, a protein snack. Sugar tends to dull cognition in the brain, and that makes homework harder. Sleep disorders are extremely common in ADHD, and sleep apnea in particular causes increases in cortisol, which feeds anxiety. Yet, think about it, that if the brain gets the message that there's not enough oxygen coming in while you're asleep, the brain panics and says, oh no, and squirts adrenaline and, to get the oxygen going again. And you squirt adrenaline all night, off and on, your cortisol goes up, and without intervention, cortisol takes about 26 hours to clear fully out of the body. So with the high incidence of sleep disorders and ADHD, it's really key for folks to understand how important getting checked for a sleep disorder is for children and adults, to make sure that that's not an additional factor making the ADHD worse and making anxiety more of a problem. So, snacks, making sure that there isn't a sleep disorder or getting it treated if there is, making sure that the child comes home with the necessary information. If a child's having trouble paying attention in class, they can miss the verbal direction of, write this down, and they don't hear that, and they didn't write down their homework directions. And when they say, I don't know what to do, sometimes they actually didn't get the directions. And then we have, the problem that some kids with ADHD really want to be independent, and they think they know what to do, but they actually don't know what to do. And when the parents say, well, that doesn't make sense, then they can have a meltdown over that.
We are going to need to go to break. However, when we get back, I'd like to follow up with this and actually continue on. I've actually got a question for you along the way. So
great.
Love equals love.
This is Sister Juanita Seerley inviting you to tune in every Sunday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. to listen to God's saving word. You will find
Joanne Topoli,
Danny Carlton,
and many wonderful guests to inspire, affirm, and challenge you. So we'll see you.
God bless you.
Don't miss the Tom Joyner Morning Show.
Sybil, in light of people being possibly stranded in the wrong place because of the weather, there's someone out there saying this right now. Alexa, give me a good lie.
That's not possible.
Have a good weekend. Guy Torrey on Monday with If Guy Were You and a whole lot more on the TJMS.
The Tom Joyner Morning Show, tomorrow morning from 6 till 9 a.m. on News Talk 1490 WERE and streaming live at blackplanetradio.com.
Hello, this is Donna Gilcher of Starfish Speaks. Join us every Sunday, 1 to 2 on WERE 1490 to discuss hot topics in education. We will talk about resources in the community that address the needs of children with disabilities and enhance the lives of parents and much more. So join us every Sunday, 1 to 2 on WERE 1490 for Starfish Speaks. If you have a question, we have answers.
WERE Cleveland Heights, WENZ HD2, and WZAK HD3 Cleveland.
All right, welcome back to Starfish Speaks right here on News Talk 1490 WERE.
So, Greg, as we were going to break, Holley was talking about started talking about some of the homework wars, and one thing that came out big is protein snack. Not giving, cookies and milk when you get home, but a protein snack. But the other big thing was the issue with the school connection. And so, Holley, a lot of times we want to make sure parents understand what kind of accommodations should parents have for homework. So I always recommend there being, parent-teacher communication and second set of books at home for children so that they have them. Nowadays, most of everything is on the Internet. But then the other piece that we try to make sure that we put in those IEPs is some kind of stopgap for parents because, if a kid's brain is just so fried, allowing them the opportunity to write at the top and say, can't do tonight, do another day, and the kid's not penalized. Can you think of other accommodations that parents should be asking for on IEPs?
Yeah. On average, processing speed in ADHD is about 40% slower. So you can guess that homework is going to take 40% longer, even if there wasn't any anxiety and avoidance, which is so common for kids with ADHD during homework. So, getting an accommodation of setting a stretch of time for how long a child will work at an assignment. Say, the teacher might agree to 20 minutes. And when 20 minutes is up, the parent writes 20 minutes. And the teacher sees what the child was able to accomplish in that 20 minutes. There's also the accommodation of a child being able to show that they've learned, the concept or the material without having to do drills of repeat and repeat and repeat. And research shows that, drill and kill, repeat, 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 doesn't actually reinforce learning. So, allowing a child to simply demonstrate that they learned the concept or the facts and then be done with their homework is also a great accommodation. In addition to the accommodations, we want our kids, when they finish school, one, to be able to work as independently as possible. And sometimes they need more dependence on the way to get there. But we also want them to be able to tolerate frustration to get through things. And that's a key piece that is often missing in the IEPs in terms of, homework as well as school. But teaching a child, how to deal with their frustration, how to manage it, how to understand it, and so that over time they can learn, for example, that if I just put out one more effort, I am stimulating my neurons, and neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that wire together are showing learning in my brain. Children with ADHD are often allergic to failure, and so they won't get started because it seems too hard. And if they understand that failure is a part of learning and that frustration is a part of learning, that can help change the context of that inner experience. Research is really clear that just simply being able to name a feeling, such as I'm anxious, or I'm angry, or I'm hurt, or I'm scared, brings down the stress level in the body. So just, there are things that the school can do that can help ameliorate some of these challenges with the homework wars, in addition to the accommodations that can make a difference.
And that does make a whole lot of sense. And you learn something new every day.
Right. Right, and it takes tolerating frustration to do that.
Exactly, and a whole bunch of patience.
Yes, which folks with ADHD often are short on, and so, right. They need ways to understand that about their brain, and that their brain is fooling them into thinking that avoidance is the solution.
Exactly.
It reminds me of something that my mother used to say when I was little that annoyed me to no end and usually made me quite upset. That was, patience is a virtue.
Yeah, I've heard that
the
quite a bit.
The funny part is nowadays, because that's one of the things that kind of I became very accustomed to and have now quite owned in my own life. I've now realized I'm now saying it to my mother more often than I think she ever said it to me when I was little. So
it's come back on her, basically.
Right. You learned it very well. She repeated it enough times, right, that you've got it memorized.
Yes, along with also the sign language for no.
Yeah, I want to throw a question back to Willem and have him jump in on his experience and get some of your input on that real quick, because we're running out of time. So Willem experienced homework wars constantly, and there was always power struggles with homework. So, Willem, jump in and tell us from a kid's perspective, what does that feel like?
Well, I'll say that I remember much of the turmoil and the battles and the hurt feelings, everything else along the way, and the feelings like nobody was actually hearing me when I kept saying that, I didn't, want to actually do this or that now, that I couldn't do it at this point. I couldn't think about it. I couldn't actually pay attention to that or whatever. But I'll say that the homework wars, I think, for a lot of time with it was there was that avoidance thing. There were things that I didn't want to do or didn't want to actually have to focus on or pay attention to, and I didn't want to have to struggle through trying to pay attention to it. And so I didn't want to force myself, and so I kind of just, I guess in fear that I wouldn't do it as well as I could have otherwise, I just didn't. There were a lot of times, though, I would say that in hindsight, I spent a lot of time and a lot of, thought and attention in figuring out the most creative ways to get out of having to do it and figuring out the most creative and inventive manner to actually avoid doing it, that I'm not entirely sure that I actually saved much effort there.
Man.
I think you'd have a lot of parents probably listening that are nodding their heads, because parents witness over and over that a kid can spend 2 hours avoiding an assignment that when they get down to it takes 15 minutes.
Absolutely. So, Holley, what advice would you give to our listeners who have children with ADHD?
Or even to those kids with ADHD.
Yeah, even with the kids themselves. What advice would you give to them?
Yeah. Well, first to the parents is, don't sacrifice your relationship, on the altar of homework. It's not worth it. In the long haul, a kid knowing that there's an adult who believes in them, adult who understands that something is so daunting that they're, willing to fight for 2 hours to avoid something and to come up with all these strategies is important in the long haul. But the other piece is understanding that when cortisol is in the system, that the brain's not going to be able to concentrate and do homework anyway. We parents have a way of throwing gasoline on our kids' spot. They're avoiding the work, they're feeling anxious, they're feeling overwhelmed, and getting worked up, and then we pressure them. And that pressure increases the emotionality inside that child and the resistance and the fight. And so they go into fight or flight, and it tends to escalate. So for the parent to understand that being able to keep their own anxiety about their child not doing homework down, and keep their own frustration and anger about it down, and even being able to say to a child, I'm getting worked up, and I'm going to go walk around the block and come back, and then we'll talk about homework again, can help. But it's also good to have a curious conversation with, rather than a judgmental, pressuring conversation, a curious conversation. Preferably at a time where you're not trying to get them to do homework, but along the lines of, help me understand what happens for you. Like Willem was just explaining what happened for him, and listening carefully and understanding and having compassion, so that the child is willing to be more open with the parent, and then, potentially and possibly to have a more collaborative approach to homework later. It can also helpful to have a structure, and so, that applies for homework. It applies for us as adults in our life to have some routines and structures that we can count on. So, child comes home, and it's important to set, when's a good time for that child to sit down and do their homework. And what is the agreement with the parent? Is it that the child will try independently first, or will the parent sit next to the child and the parent work on something themselves, because we know that for adults and kids that are working on something that they have trouble concentrating on, just having a person sitting there next to them concentrating seems to be contagious. And, the adults in the ADHD world call this the body buddy phenomenon. It's sort of a mysterious, almost magical. Somebody else is sitting at the table doing their bills, and all of a sudden I can work on this paper that I've been avoiding.
Well, thank you, Holley, for joining us. We're starting to have to wrap up here, but I will say that I think that what you just mentioned is something that even is a factor for adults as well. I've personally experienced that when even working on building my own business. I actually went to visit my dad in Canada, and we literally just sat at the dining room table with him reading his newspaper while I was finally starting able to make some progress in some of the paperwork I had to do and whatever else for my business. So there was something about that presence.
That's a great example of healthy dependence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Holley. Guys, you did another great job.
Thank you so very
maybe
much.
I'll never come back from Hawaii.
Hey, that's
really? Please don't tease that.
Hey, that's fine. Hey, look, if it wasn't for my snow tires, I wouldn't have made it through the end of this anyway. So it's,
right.
it's cool.
Listen to you next week, guys.
All right. Thank you so much, Don, and
Thanks
thank
so
you,
much,
Holley.
Great talking with you all.
I think we should probably have you on again another time to actually maybe touch on some more of this, because it was pretty dense and pretty also pretty big topic. So.
And thank you so very much for listening. Join us again next Sunday right here on Starfish Speaks, News Talk 1490.
The proceeding was a paid program brought to you by Starfish Speaks. The views and opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of this station or its management.